Tracy Siegel, and I am an environmental scientist, and I have been working in environmental science for about 25 years all around the state of Florida, and I've seen the degradation that's occurred in our water bodies, our springs and rivers and lakes. And so I decided to be a volunteer for the Florida Springs Institute to try to protect the springs and protect other water bodies. And so I'm here to talk to you today about, to describe these water bodies to you and to explain some of the problems that we're having and some of the actions that you all can do to help protect our water, because it's real important for you, and you'll understand more after this presentation, that you depend on clean and abundant water every single day, because that's what you're drinking. And we're trying to keep the water clean so that you always have fresh, clean water to drink. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in environmental science, and both of those degrees were from here at the University of Florida. And just in the time that I've been working, I've just seen so much degradation occur. So that's what we'll talk about today. So I'm going to start out by asking, who here has gone to a spring before? Raise your hand. Wow! Look at all the people who have visited springs. Okay, raise your hand if you've been to more than one spring. Wow. Raise your hand if you've been to a spring more than 3 times. Wow. Okay, who's been to a spring more than 5 times? More than 10 times? So, it looks like some of you go on a regular, or you have gone on a regular basis, and that's great because springs are a wonderful place here, especially in hot Florida in the summertime, a wonderful place to go. What are some of the springs that you've been to? Heart Springs, Rainbow, Jenny Springs, Poe Springs, Manatee Springs, Ishatutney, Blue. Anyone gone to Silver Springs? Yeah, good. What? Lithia Springs, very good. Lots of springs. Okay, well, here, who has been tubing down the Ishatutney? A wonderful thing, wonderful place. And if you haven't, I would encourage you next summer to go there, rent inner tubes, and tube down the Ishatutney, because it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. But I will advise you to go early in the day, because there is a limit on the number of people that they will allow to tube down the Ishatutney. And in the summertime, on the weekends, they reach their limit about before lunchtime, around 10:30 or 11 o'clock. So you have to go early. It's so popular, but it's so worth it. We like to go down the Ishatutney during the winter time and kayak down the Ishatutney when it's quiet and peaceful and just incredibly beautiful there. Can you see the clear water, the blue clear water, and the flow of the water? This is from the water coming out of the spring and flowing in this Ishatutney River and propelling us down on our kayaks. Manatees use springs a lot also, and in fact they're very dependent on springs in the winter time to actually stay alive. And that's because the water that comes out of springs is coming from the aquifer, and it's an even temperature of about 72 degrees year-round. So in the summertime when the air is really hot, the springs feel cold, right, because it's 72. In the winter time when the air is cold, that water is 72 and it feels really warm, and it is much warmer than the water out in the ocean or the rivers. And so in the winter time when it freezes and the water bodies in the ocean and the rivers turn cold, it's too cold for manatees to survive. So the manatees will actually swim up the rivers to the springs and stay right there at the spring where the water is 72, and that's how they survive. So very important for this threatened species here in Florida. This is a picture of Rainbow Springs, and a lot of people come to our springs to go diving, and people come from all around the country, all around the world, because we're the only place that has so many springs. We have over 1,000 springs here, and so they're very targeted for tourists to come and visit. Not all the tourists that come to Florida go to Disney World. A lot of them go to our springs. And when they come to springs, do you know what they bring to our springs? Scuba gear. What else?
Wine.
Money. They bring money. They bring money to rent scuba gear, and they bring money to rent dive boat operators, and they spend their money at hotels and restaurants and gasoline and souvenirs. They spend a tremendous amount of money here. And so it's really important for us to protect our springs and the water in our springs so that these tourists can keep coming to enjoy. And certainly for us to enjoy too, but for all of the other people that are coming here. And the reason for that is because they spend so much money around the springs. There was a study that was conducted, and they determined that over $30 million per year is spent in the communities because of the springs. That's the ecotourism dollars. The tourists that are coming in to enjoy the economy, the environment, the ecology. That's the ecotourism dollars, and it's a tremendous amount of money. And so to have a resource that generates $30 million a year, if you do the financial calculations, you would find that that resource is worth about $10 billion. So if you have an investment that's worth $10 billion, it could produce $300 million a year. So if our springs are worth about $10 billion, we need to do everything we can to protect them, don't we? Because we want to keep them producing water, producing money in our community, in our economy, but it's also producing spring clean water for us. So, as I mentioned, Florida is very unique, North Central Florida, because of the concentration of springs. Over 1,000 springs within North Central Florida, and these green dots mark where some of the springs are located. Not all the springs are shown here, but they follow water bodies, and they flow out into water bodies. So this is the Suwannee River, and look at all the springs along the Suwannee River. This is the Santa Fe River. So you can see where Ishnatucknee is related to Gainesville's right here in Alachua County. Silver Springs down here by Ocala and Marion County. Wakulla Springs, just below Tallahassee. So a very unique place that we live here because of our springs. Here's a photo of Chassahowitzka Springs, just above Tampa. And look at this hole right here. This is where the water, the cool, 72-degree clean water comes up out of the ground. It's coming from our Floridan Aquifer. Our Floridan Aquifer is a big reservoir of water underneath us all, and it's contained within lime rock, and that may seem strange that you have water within lime rock, but that lime rock is full of holes, it's full of cavities, it's full of conduits and channels. There's openings as large as this room that hold water, and there's areas within the lime rock that are really small. And that water under the lime rock is our Floridan Aquifer. That's where we get our drinking water supply. So every time that you turn on your spigot, the water has come from the Floridan Aquifer. If you live here in Florida, you're getting your water from the Floridan Aquifer. And it's coming up through, in the case here where you have springs, you have a conduit or a channel that goes from the surface down to the aquifer, and there's enough pressure in the aquifer that is pushing the water, and it comes up out of the ground there. So that's how our springs are tied into our Floridan Aquifer. As I mentioned, there's some really big openings in the aquifer below us, and we didn't know that until divers, underwater cave divers, scientists, went and explored and mapped some of the aquifer system. And that's when we learned that there were really big channels underground and that allowed water to flow very quickly. So you may not have heard this term, but there's underground rivers below us. In some places where there's these big channels, there are underground rivers where water's flowing very quickly. And water can only escape the aquifer by flowing out of a spring or coming up in a pipe, a well that we use to extract water. But that's a photo of two divers that are exploring the aquifer. So the Floridan Aquifer is under the entire state of Florida. That is where we get our water supply. And that the aquifer does extend north of us into parts of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. But we're really fortunate here because the water has historically been very clean under the aquifer, very pure, that you can pump the water out and drink it without purifying it. That's changing now, and I'll explain why. But it's been very cheap, very easy, and very abundant to get this water. It's not the same in other places in the country. A lot of places depend, they do not have an aquifer. They have to get their drinking water supply through rivers or lakes or reservoirs. And the city of Atlanta, big Atlanta, Georgia, they do not have an aquifer, and they get their water from Lake Lanier. They have a huge lake, and they pump water out of it. That lake is, you can go and swim there, you can go boating there, there's plenty of fish and turtles, and it's just, you look at it, it's a regular lake. Well, that water is not very clean. You couldn't take a glass of water out of Lake Lanier and drink it. That water has to be pumped to a water treatment facility, and it undergoes tremendous treatment before it's potable or drinkable for people to drink. It's very expensive. So we're very fortunate that we have such an abundant, clean water supply, but it's changing, and we need to protect that. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because we have not been on a sustainable pathway at all. Just in the last 2 to 3 decades, we've had major degradation occurring to the aquifer, and if it continues in that direction, you all are the ones that are going to be suffering, and everyone coming after you is going to be suffering because of the water problems that are occurring. So we at the Springs Institute are trying to influence politics, our leaders, our environmental leaders, to get them to put a greater emphasis on protecting the water supply. So here's a cross-section of what the aquifer looks like. As I mentioned, it's lime rock, underground below us, full of water. So this is the aquifer. And where there's an opening in the lime rock, and that opening goes all the way up to the ground, to the surface, is where water comes out as a spring. That's the only way that water can get out of the aquifer, except either by a spring or by a well. And that's how we get our water, is through wells. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of wells that are penetrating the aquifer and extracting water out of the aquifer. And this is just one. Gainesville Regional Utilities has about 12 wells, and their well field, which is out by the airport. How many people get a GRU electric bill every month, or your parents? Yes, a lot of you, and probably more than raise their hand. Most of us in the city of Gainesville get our water from GRU. Well, GRU, or if you don't, then you have your own private well, and I have a private well, because I don't get GRU service where I'm at. And so GRU is pumping water, or in my case, every time I turn on the spigot, my pump is kicking on and I'm extracting water from the aquifer. GRU is extracting about 20 million gallons of water every day to distribute to all the households that are hooked up to the GRU system. And that's a tremendous amount of water coming out of the aquifer. So the only way that water can recharge the aquifer is through rainfall. And so we're going to get a lot of aquifer recharge this week with Hurricane Matthew coming along here. It's going to have detrimental problems, but as far as the aquifer is concerned, we're going to get a lot of good recharge there. And what happens is when it rains, water infiltrates into the ground. It moves through the sandy soils and down to the aquifer. But the recharge potential throughout the state of Florida is not equivalent. In some places, like outside of Gainesville, where it's really sandy and dry, there's very high aquifer recharge because water flows through the soil to the aquifer. But places like here in Gainesville, we have a thick clay layer below us, and so it's hard for the water to infiltrate and get through that clay layer. So here in Gainesville, a lot of the water flows to creeks like Hogtown Creek, or Possum Creek, or Rock Creek, and those creeks flow until they reach a sinkhole, and then when they reach a sinkhole, the water goes into the sinkhole and down into the aquifer. So a little bit of difference in the geology, but that's the only way that water is getting to the aquifer. So groundwater is our most important natural resource. We need it. Just like we need air to breathe, we need water to drink, we need clean water to drink. But it's also the only water that's supplying our water to our springs. And the springs flow into rivers, and so if we don't have enough water coming out of our springs, then we don't have water in our rivers. Has anyone gone on the Santa Fe River, or the Swanee River, or the St. Johns River? Yeah, and you see all the water there? A lot of that is spring flow. That's water that's come out of the spring and flowed into source. And so it's real important to protect our rivers. We've got to protect our springs. And of course, groundwater is our primary source of drinking water. So if we're not protecting our aquifer, we're not going to have clean water. So see how it's all tied in together? We've got to protect our water at every level to have clean water. And there's been a lot of water issues, water pollution issues in the news recently. Maybe you heard about the big sinkhole that opened up down in Polk County. It was under a big reservoir that was lined and had a lot of waste material in it. And the sinkhole opened up and millions of gallons of contaminated water went into the groundwater. So that was a big pollution source. And another issue that's going on right now is red tide is in the ocean right out from Sarasota and Manatee County. And that there's fish kills and it's abrasive, the water's abrasive to swim in. And all of these are being called, these are all pollution sources. And so it's really important that we protect our water supply. So before I go any further, does anyone have any questions on what I've talked about so far? Any questions? No? Yes?
Is there a fear of the aquifer running out of water if we go through a dry season?
Is there fear of the aquifer running out of water if we go through a dry season? Absolutely. It's not that it's going to run out of water, but the water level is going to drop so much that that we're going to have problems, and I'm going to talk about that now. But absolutely, that's one of the big problems that we're having is that our aquifer has dropped tremendously over the last 2 to 3 decades, so much so that it has dried up springs, it has dried up lakes, especially during droughts. The Santa Fe River quit flowing about 4 years ago when we had a major drought and the springs weren't flowing and the water wasn't coming into the Santa Fe River. And there were places in the Santa Fe River that you could walk across it that the water was like waist deep or more shallow. So yes, it is a big problem. Thank you. So here is a picture of a spring at the Ishotuckney. Yes, ma'am.
Is the water in the spring dangerous for the filtering?
Is the water in the spring?
Is the water in the spring dangerous or like unhealthy before they filter it?
So she asked, is the water in the spring dangerous? And that's a really good question. Thank you. The water that historically came out of the springs was very clear and very pure, and you could drink it. What we're seeing now is really high levels of nitrogen coming out. And nitrate nitrogen is thought it has health problems, and we don't know all the health problems, but it is getting more dangerous. I wouldn't take a glass of water and drink it from the springs now. I would have when I first started as a scientist. So, and it's a direction that we need to change. We need to clean it up. So thank you for asking that. So here's a picture. These two pictures were taken at the very same location 16 years apart. And in 16 years, this is what this spring at Ishotuckney Spring, it's called Devil's Eye Spring. It's at Ishotuckney, changed over a 1.5 decade period. It went from very blue, clear, green, with a healthy grass understory, to algae-covered bottom with brown water. And that's because we are polluting the water with nitrogen. And so that's what I'll talk to you about. So the characteristics, there's 2 characteristics of a healthy spring. It's abundant water. We need to have a lot of water, so asking about the springs drying up, this is a big issue. And then we need to have clean water that's not polluted. So what happens, as I mentioned, we have an aquifer below us. And the aquifer, there's all sorts of holes and cavities and channels within the aquifer, and the aquifer level can drop. And here's a kind of a way to think about it. If you have a bucket of water, imagine that as the aquifer, and you have this opening here in the bucket. And the water comes out at that hole in the bucket. But if that water level drops below that opening, then the water's not going to come out of the bucket, right? Well, that's what happens if the water level drops in the aquifer, water's not going to come out in the springs. And we've seen that happen. This is a historic photo of White Sulphur Springs, which is located north of us on the Suwannee River. And it was a vibrant spring forever and ever until we started pumping so much groundwater out of the ground. And then during drought, this is what the spring looks like. because we have lowered the aquifer so much below that indentation of the bucket that water no longer comes out of that spring. And the reason that that water level has been dropped is it's multiple reasons. First of all, this spring is within the influence of drawdown of Jacksonville. Jacksonville pumps about 100 million gallons of water a day, and their effects on the groundwater extend out about 60 miles. So they pump so much water out of the ground, they create this drawdown of the aquifer that lowers the water level where they're pumping, and water flows downhill, right? Water always flows downhill, even in the aquifer. So if Jacksonville's pumping a lot of water, they're dropping the aquifer 20 or 30 feet, guess which way the water's flowing? Towards Jacksonville, right? Underground. So it's no longer flowing to the aquifer, and it's no longer flowing to the spring, and the spring's not getting water. Other things cause the spring to go dry. It was the phosphate mining that was occurring nearby. They were extracting a tremendous amount of water and dropping the aquifer as well. And right now, in the environmental news, is that the two counties north of us, Union and Bradford, there's four private landowners that are proposing to put in a phosphate mine on both of those counties. And luckily, Alachua County is fighting that, saying we oppose the phosphate mine because you will influence the aquifer and you could pollute the rivers, and that river flows into Alachua County. So big threats to the aquifer. The other reason why this dried up is because of the agriculture and all the other water users. So it was a combination of many big water users. So this is the big water users. Agriculture uses a tremendous amount with these large irrigation systems. They're pumping a tremendous amount of water. You can't imagine how much water they're pumping. And in order to irrigate a big field, those pumps have to run all day long. And when you irrigate in the middle of the day, when it's hot, you get so much evaporation. Most of that water is evaporating, and very little of it is actually watering the crops. So it's a very, very inefficient use of water and a very extreme amount of water that's being used. Residential. All of us, Gainesville, here in Gainesville, the biggest water users are residential because there's so many people and we're using so much water. And the biggest thing here is our biggest water use is watering our lawns. Over half, for those of people who water their lawns, over half of your water consumption is watering your grass. And as a scientist, I would say that it's much, much more important for us to protect and sustain our aquifer and our water supply than it is to have immaculate green lawns. And so, as an individual and as a scientist, I've made the decision I do not water my lawn. I haven't for years and years. I don't fertilize it either. And I have green grass, and I have to mow it. So my grass doesn't turn brown and die just because I'm not watering it. And I would suggest to all of you that anyone who your household is watering your lawn, or your friends, or your other people you know, to suggest that you would much rather than preserve the water and protect the water for the long term instead of the short term benefits of your yard. Yes?
Say, because I know down where my grandparents live in West Palm Beach, they have certain days where you are allowed to water your lawn and use your hose and stuff. Would that help benefit the aquifers if people all around Florida did that?
So she asked if you just had certain days where you watered your lawn, would it help the aquifer? Well, the best way that will help the aquifer is not watering it at all. And when you have a certain day, like say your watering day is Tuesday, or no, say it's Friday. So everyone who can water their lawn on Friday, they have an automatic irrigation system and it comes on Friday. Well, guess what? We have a hurricane coming on Friday. And just think of all those people who are going to be watering their lawns on Friday when we have a hurricane. So it's not a good system. It's much, much better to not water at all. Now, I will say that some of the communities, and maybe your grandparents are in a community like this, they have reuse water that goes to their house. And reuse water is treated wastewater. It's come from the wastewater treatment plant, and there are neighborhoods that are piped in with reuse water, so when they're watering their lawns, they're watering with reuse or treated wastewater and not pumping clean water out of the aquifer. And that's a little bit different. So that may be what they're doing, but overall, I would say irrigating your lawn is a really bad idea, and it's really counter to trying to protect this valuable resource, especially for such a short-term gain of having a lush green lawn. And I can't really understand it because I have a green lawn too, and it doesn't get watered. Okay, so when we pump water out of the ground, as I mentioned, we cause a drawdown effect to occur. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
What if you live on a farm, and you have to water your crops?
If you live on a farm and you have to water your crops, that is a big problem because that's what we're having. A lot of the drawdown in heavily farmed areas is because with that big irrigation system, it's causing a drawdown. And so there needs to be a compromise, and this is a problem. I'll get your question in just a minute. There needs to be a compromise between someone using such a large amount of water to produce a profit that's going to be affecting all of these other people. So if you have a farmer, that farmer could be using hundreds of thousands of gallons of water a day to have a profit. Well, if that's affecting all of the other users of water, it's something we need to think about because we can't, that's what's gotten us in trouble is that we've had large pollution and large water uses for profit at the expense of everyone else who's suffering in all the water bodies. So it's a very difficult situation, but we need to rein back all the water use, and agriculture is a big water user. You had a question?
In California, there's something that's more of a trickle system where the water is right next to the crops and stuff is going underground.
Yes.
Is that something you're considering?
Yes, and so that goes back to your question. He asked, some agriculture has trickle system or low water pressure irrigation. So it's not these overhead irrigation, but it's water that's directed right at the roots of the crop. And that's a much more efficient way of using water for agriculture. And you aren't having as much evaporation and you're not irrigating places that don't need irrigating. So that was a really good question. Thank you. Okay, so when you pump water, you create a drawdown, as I mentioned earlier. So what happens? It's like sucking on a straw in milkshake. You know how when you suck on a straw in a milkshake and all that milkshake's going to the straw? Well, that's kind of what happens here, where all the water is going to the well that's pumping water up, and it's causing the aquifer to draw down. So there are some major water caution areas in Florida because we have depleted the aquifer so much. In the Jacksonville area right here, the water levels the aquifer levels drop between 20 and 60 feet below the ground. That effect has been so severe, it reaches out so far, like up to 60 miles, that it's affected the lakes in Keystone Heights and Melrose, all the way out because of so much water that's being extracted in Jacksonville. In southwest Florida around Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Plant City, the water levels have really dropped over 60 feet in some cases and even caused saltwater intrusion, which is another complication. And so a situation that occurred right next to Tampa and Plant City, I'll show you an example of that. As I mentioned, you have the aquifer and water in the lime rock below us. And many places in the lime rock are cavities. There are holes in the lime rock, and they hold water. Well, if you drop the water table, so this is the water table, and if you drop the water table because you're pumping so much, the cavities no longer have water that's supporting the cavities, right? And so you have subsidence of the ground, and the ground starts to cave in, and it caves in even more and creates a sinkhole. And so during extreme droughts where we're pumping a lot of water and the water table's dropping, we have a proliferation of sinkholes that can open up. And that's exactly what happened in 2010, in the winter of 2010 in Plant City, which is the strawberry capital of this area, Florida. We had an extended cold spell where temperature was dropping below 32 degrees, below freezing, for multiple nights in a row. And strawberries are grown in the wintertime, and they can tolerate 32-degree freezing, but they will die if the temperature goes below 32, like 28 or 27 degrees. So a way of stopping the temperature from dropping below 32 is to irrigate your crops With water, let it freeze over and that ice stays at 32. So even if the temperature drops to 28 degrees, your strawberries are going to stay at 32 and they won't die. So hundreds of farmers started turning on their irrigation all at one time. And within a week or 10-day period, we had mass destruction occurring in that area. So over 140 sinkholes opened up, damaged hundreds of wells, caused property values to drop and insurance rates to go up. So it was a major problem that occurred because of this. So this is a photo of some of the sinkholes that opened up around houses, on roads. This is Interstate 4, it's like I-75. Sinkholes opened up on I-4. Here's where a sinkhole opened, or you had subsidence on this road, along this road. You can see a sinkhole that opened up here. So major problems occurred there. So I got to talking so much I forgot to start my experiment, but I'm going to start my experiment here for you all to see this demonstration. So I am going to sprinkle coffee onto this. First of all, this is a representation of the soil below us with sand on the top and then lime rock and clays in the soil. And I want to show you how pollutants move through the soil, and that's going to be the next thing that we talk about. I sprinkled coffee on top of the soil, and that's to pretend that we're fertilizing with nitrogen, with fertilizer. Okay. And then I put water on there for rainfall. And so this is what happens whenever we fertilize our lawns or agriculture fertilizes large crops. And so I will show you how that works in just a minute. So the next problem that we have with springs is pollution from nitrogen. And when we have pollution, when nitrogen gets in our water supply, it grows algae. It grows algae really good. In some cases, it has fish kills when it's really severe, like red tide. The water problem down in the Indian River Lagoon, if you've heard of that, the water coming out of Lake Okeechobee, they're calling it guacamole water. It is thick as guacamole with algae and pollutants. It's horrible. And so that's what happens when nitrogen gets into our water supply. And in Florida here, where we have sandy soils, nitrogen just leaches right through the soil to the aquifer. And how do we get nitrogen? Well, the sources are agriculture is a huge source of nitrogen in heavily farmed areas where you're growing row crops and fertilizing, like growing corn or watermelons or hay crop. Also where there's large farming operations with cows. Cows produce a lot of waste, a lot of manure. And so just imagine how much manure just those cows right there are producing, and multiply that by, say, a farm has 500 cows on their farm, which is not unusual. All of the waste of the cows, when they come in to be milked, all the manure gets washed to a sewage lagoon, a big open pond that's a sewage lagoon, and then the water gets pumped out of that onto the field. So all of that is very heavily enriched with nitrogen, and that nitrogen, when it's put on the soil, leaches right through the soil. So if we're trying to protect the springs, the state can't just buy us springs, like this is the Ishnotaki Springs right here, and protect those springs. You have to protect the whole watershed that drains to the springs. And in this case, this is the Ishnotaki Springs, and the whole watershed that drains to Ishnotaki is 300 square miles and encompasses the whole town of Lake City. So that means that everything that we do within this watershed can potentially affect the Ishnotaki Springs, and also affect all the water that we're drinking that's below, because all the water here is flowing to Ishnotaki. So if you have a big farm with 500 cows, that waste is potentially polluting Ishnotaki Springs. So our springs are in trouble. We have excessive groundwater pumping, which is lowering the aquifer, and we have excessive nitrate that is polluting. And I'm going to back up because I forgot to do the experiment again, sorry. So I need 2 volunteers that would come up and help me. Boy, that man back there just shot up his hand real fast. I'm sorry, I would have had more experiments, so I should be able to help. Okay, the first thing is, when I lift this up, will you slide this? Would you hold that water up? Oops. So that is just coffee water, but that shows you when you add nitrogen to the soil, it leaks and it rains. That nitrogen leaches right through the soil and comes out in the water that we drink and in the springs and in the rivers. And that's what's polluting our water bodies, is all of the nitrogen and the pollutants that we're putting on our soils, and then it washing off and getting into our water bodies. Thank you very much. Invisible. You can't see it, you can't taste it. So if you're drinking polluted, nitrogen polluted water, you're not going to know it because you can't see it and you can't taste it or smell it. So it's a real problem, and that's what one of the things we're trying to protect, because as I mentioned, a lot of the decisions that are being made in Tallahassee are being made to promote businesses and money. And it's at the expense of all of us not having clean water. And that's why we're having polluted rivers also, and polluted and having red tide. Okay, so these are the reasons why our springs are in trouble, but also the reason why our drinking water aquifer is in trouble. Is that we're pumping so much water, we're lowering the aquifer, and we're polluting the aquifer with nitrogen and other pollutants. So what can be done to do because of this? Well, the most important thing, we should all be very conscientious of the water that we're using. We should all be trying to conserve the water and just be very conscientious. But the most important thing that we can all do is not water our lawns. For those who water their lawns, we can cut our water consumption in half by just eliminating this water source. Electricity. Power plants are big water users. There's a big power plant on the St. Johns River that produces water. GRU has a power plant, and it uses a tremendous amount of water. So if we conserve electricity, we're also conserving water. So it's hard to believe, but the groundwater consumption, our water use is about 140 gallons of water per day. But if we conserve, we can get it down to 40 gallons per day. So this is really important. This is a real important take-home message for all of you, is that clean and abundant water is likely going to be the most important environmental problem affecting your life and your quality of life. And so that's what we're trying to do, is turn this around so that we do have clean and abundant water for all of you. So are there any more questions for this presentation. Be glad to take some more questions from you. Wait, I have a question. Yes, ma'am. What is my favorite spring to go to? I love to see the manatees at Blue Springs in the winter. I love to go down to Ishnatucky. They're all really nice. I really enjoy a lot of them. Yes, ma'am.
Where did you graduate and get your degree from?
Oh, that was a good question. Where did I graduate and get my degree from? The University of Florida. Here, I got a bachelor's and a master's degree at the university. Do you have a question? What do you do if you have a garden? Well, you can, I had a vegetable garden for many years and I irrigated it. And what I did is I was very careful to watch the weather report. And so I only irrigated when it had not rained for many days. I mulched my garden heavily. And so when you mulch, it retains a lot of water. And I planted plants that don't require a lot of water. And if you have a yard, you can plant native plants, native Florida plants that don't use a lot of water. So those are all ways to conserve water. Yes, ma'am. What is my favorite bottled water? Okay, folks. I don't drink bottled water because I have such clean water coming out of my well, and I'm trying to make it protected that way. But a lot of people think that bottled water is a big water user. It uses very little compared to other water sources. There's not very much water in that bottle compared to, say, irrigation that's irrigating or you're watering your lawns. The problem with bottled water is all of the plastic that's being used. All of the plastic that's being made and going to our landfills and not being recycled. So my suggestion to you, I carry a metal water bottle. I use that over and over again and I fill that up. So I'm not buying plastic. I have this for this demonstration, but I don't buy water and it's because of the plastic that is being used. Yes?
Do you have any children? And if you do you not let them buy water bottles and stuff like that?
I have one son. He actually graduated here about 4 years ago from New Holtz. And when he lived at home, he was not allowed to have bottled water. And when he took showers, after about 8 or 9 minutes, I knocked on the door, the bathroom door, and said, "You're using too much water now. I'm sure you're clean." So he was subjected to a mom that was very conscientious of water. As a teenager, you kind of think about, it's nice to take long showers. He knows that he shouldn't use bottled water. Sometimes he does, but he is conscientious of water. You have a question?
So my father's like a sinkhole specialist.
Oh.
The more water that we use, the more business we have.
So his father is a sinkhole specialist, and the more water we use, the more business he will get. But it's at the expense of other people, and that's the problem we have. Agriculture, the more water they use, the more profit they make. But they're polluting, so it's a trade-off that we've got to protect. We have another question.
Yeah. Does your son still do the same thing that he used to do at home and stuff? And does he want to help save the springs?
Does my son still do the same things at home, and does he want to save the springs? Yes, he's been on many springs trips with us, and he understands the clean water. So yeah, we have instilled an environmental ethic in him. And that's what I hope that you all will get out of this, is an environmental ethic, a water ethic. 5 minutes? An environmental ethic that you will understand the value of water. And we do need water to make money, businesses, agriculture, utilities, but we also need to protect it. So it's a trade-off. We need to protect water and just use the minimal amount that we can to sustain us. Does anyone else have questions? Yes?
Creek have spring water in it?
Does creek have spring water in it? Only if a spring flows into a creek, does it? And Boulware Springs over by Paynes Prairie is a spring that flows into Boulware Creek. So yes, that has spring water in it. Most of the creeks do. Because that's what's feeding them, is spring water. Now, a lot of the creeks will also have stormwater runoff. So think about it tomorrow when Hurricane Matthew starts raining here and water hits the ground on roads and parking lots. A lot of that water is going to flow to our creeks, right? So all of a sudden the creeks have a water level like right here, and it's starts raining and the water level is going to go up like this in the creeks, and that's from the rainfall. But when it's low, like a steady amount, that's usually a spring flow. And then it's augmented by a huge rain event. So it can be both. Yes?
Where would we get water if the aquifers dried up?
Where would we get water if the aquifer dried up? That's a really good question. Here in Florida, we would probably do saltwater, oops, I just drew a blank. Saltwater desalinization. We would desalinate our water, and that means we would take salt water, we would subject it to a lot of energy to pull out the salt, and then it would produce fresh water for us to drink. But desalinization is very, very expensive. It takes a lot of energy, and our water bills would probably be like 20 times what we're paying now. And it would take a tremendous amount of electricity. So it's not a good alternative at all. Places that do not have an aquifer below them like we do, and there's a lot of places that don't have an aquifer, get their water out of rivers or lakes or reservoirs. And Atlanta has Lake Lanier. It's a big lake, and that's where they extract their water, is from a lake. But the problem is that the water that's in rivers or reservoirs or lakes is dirty. You have to clean it. You wouldn't drink water right out of the lake. Well, the company, they have to clean the water before you can drink it. So we're really fortunate to have the Florida Aquifer. It's so clean. It has been cleaned. And if we protect it and change the direction, we want to make sure that all of you have clean and abundant water. And so that's what we're trying to do. Any more questions? These are really good questions. I really appreciate all your questions. Any more? Okay, well, thank you very much.